In the heart of New York City, tucked away on a busy street corner, there was a small cafe that smelled like fresh coffee and baked goods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy little place with wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and walls covered in old paintings. People came here for many reasons, some to grab a quick cup of coffee before work, others to sit quietly with their thoughts while watching the city rush by outside. On this particular afternoon, a man walked into the cafe holding the hand of a young boy. The man wore an expensive suit, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. His name was Richard Langley, one of the richest men in America. But today, he wasn't thinking about business deals or stock markets. Today, he was focused solely on the boy beside him, his 8-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan had cerebral palsy, which meant life wasn't always easy for him. He couldn't walk without help, and speaking was hard too. But what Ethan lacked in physical abilities he made up for with his bright smile and curious eyes. Those eyes seemed to sparkle whenever something caught his attention, lighting up his face like sunshine breaking through clouds. Richard loved spending time with Ethan, even though it wasn't always easy. Being a billionaire came with its own set of challenges. He worked long hours, traveled constantly, and often left Ethan's care to nannies or therapists. But deep down, Richard wanted more than just material comforts for his son. He wanted moments like these, a quiet afternoon at a cafe where they could simply be together, father and son. They settled into a corner table near the window. A waitress brought them menus, but Richard barely glanced at it. Instead, he ordered 2 hot chocolates and asked if they had crayons for kids. The waitress smiled warmly and handed over a small box of colorful crayons along with a stack of napkins. As soon as the crayons were placed in front of him, Ethan's face lit up. He grabbed a blue one and started scribbling furiously on a napkin. Richard watched silently, sipping his coffee, letting Ethan lose himself in the act of creation. To most people, those random lines might not have looked like much, but to Richard, they were precious. Every mark Ethan made told a story only he understood. But then something happened that caught Richard's eye. Across the room, another waitress moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays loaded with plates of food. She had dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and her apron was slightly stained from a long day's work. Despite the chaos around her, she carried herself with calm confidence. And when she noticed Ethan drawing, she paused for a moment, her gaze softening. Without saying a word, she approached their table. For a second, Richard tensed up, not because he felt threatened, but because he wasn't used to strangers interacting with Ethan. But the woman didn't seem intrusive at all. Instead, she knelt down beside Ethan and gently said, "Hey there, I see you're making some cool art." Ethan stopped mid-scribble and looked up at her, his big eyes wide with curiosity. The woman smiled and pulled out a pen from her pocket. Without waiting for permission, she began sketching on a clean napkin, a butterfly with delicate wings that looked almost lifelike. When she finished, she held it up for Ethan to see. "What do you think?" she asked. Ethan giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that it filled the entire cafe. He reached out eagerly, pointing at the butterfly. The woman laughed softly and handed him the napkin. Then, picking up a red crayon, she guided Ethan's hand over another blank napkin, helping him trace the outline of a flower. Together, they created something neither could have done alone. Richard sat there, stunned. He'd hired countless caregivers, tutors, and therapists for Ethan over the years, yet none of them had ever connected with his son the way this stranger did. There was no judgment in her actions, no hesitation, just kindness and patience. When the woman finally stood up to leave, Ethan clutched the napkin tightly in his hand, staring at it as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. Richard called after her, wanting to thank her properly, but she waved him off with a shy smile. "It's okay," she said. "I love seeing kids draw." That brief encounter stayed with Richard long after they left the cafe. As he drove home, with Ethan asleep in the back seat, he kept replaying the scene in his mind. Who was that woman? Why had she taken the time to bond with Ethan when she clearly had other things to do? And why did her simple act of kindness make him feel both grateful and guilty at the same time. For the first time in years, Richard realized how disconnected he'd become from his own son. Yes, he provided everything Ethan needed: medical care, therapy sessions, private schooling. But had he truly been present? Had he ever taken the time to sit down and create something with Ethan, the way that waitress had done? These questions lingered in his mind as days turned into weeks. Eventually, Richard found himself returning to the cafe again and again, hoping to catch another glimpse of the kind-hearted waitress who had unknowingly sparked a change in him. What he didn't know yet was that this chance meeting would lead to something far greater than he could have imagined. Over the next few weeks, Richard became a regular at the cafe. At first, he told himself it was just to spend more time with Ethan in a relaxed setting, but deep down he knew the real reason. He wanted to see the waitress again. There was something about her that stuck with him long after their brief encounter. Her kindness felt genuine, not forced or performative like so many interactions he'd had with people over the years. And the way she connected with Ethan, it wasn't something you could fake. Each time they visited, she seemed to notice them right away. She didn't make a big deal out of it. Instead, she'd casually stop by their table while balancing trays of food or refilling coffee cups. Sometimes she'd ask Ethan what he was drawing, tilting her head as if genuinely interested. Other times, she'd join in for a few minutes, sketching alongside him. One day, she drew a dragon breathing fire. Another time, it was a rocket ship, blasting off into space. Each creation sparked laughter and excitement in Ethan, who would point and clap his hands in delight. Richard found himself watching these moments intently, studying how effortlessly she engaged with his son. It wasn't just about the art, though that was clearly important. It was the way she spoke to Ethan, the tone of her voice, the warmth in her smile. She treated him like any other kid, without pity or awkwardness. She celebrated his small victories, like when he managed to color inside the lines or trace shapes more neatly than before. For Ethan, those tiny achievements were monumental, and seeing someone else recognize that meant the world to Richard. One rainy afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual. The sound of raindrops tapping against the windows filled the silence, creating a peaceful atmosphere. Ethan was busy scribbling on a napkin, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. The waitress approached their table with an empty tray in hand, but paused when she saw Ethan's drawing. "That's amazing," she said softly, leaning closer to get a better look. "What is it?" Ethan tilted his head, unsure how to respond. He rarely spoke, especially around strangers. But the waitress didn't seem fazed. Instead, she picked up a green crayon and added a few leaves to whatever Ethan had drawn. Then she turned to Richard and said, "Your son has such an incredible imagination." Her words caught him off guard. No one had ever described Ethan that way, not even Richard himself. Sure, he knew Ethan was special, but hearing someone else acknowledge it, someone who didn't know anything about their family or their wealth, struck a chord within him. "Thank you," Richard replied, his voice softer than usual. "He doesn't talk much, but I think he understands everything." The waitress nodded thoughtfully, then hesitated for a moment before continuing. "He reminds me of my younger brother," she admitted. "He loved drawing too. We used to sit together for hours making up stories based on our pictures. It was his way of escaping, from all the hard stuff." Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "Hard stuff?" She glanced down at her hands, twisting the edge of her apron nervously. "Yeah. My dad passed away when I was little, and my mom had to raise 4 kids on her own. Money was tight, and things got complicated. Art was our escape. It helped us forget about the bills piling up or the fights we heard through the walls. My little brother lived with disabilities, so he faced extra challenges. But art gave him a voice when words failed." Her voice cracked slightly, and Richard noticed the faintest hint of sadness in her eyes. She quickly brushed it aside, forcing a small smile. "Anyway, your son reminds me of him. He has that same spark." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to patter against the windows, filling the silence between them. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. Here was this young woman sharing a piece of her soul with him, a complete stranger, and it hit him harder than he expected. In her story, he saw echoes of his own struggles as a parent. The fear of not doing enough, the constant worry about the future, the desire to protect your child from a world that often feels cruel and unfair. But there was something else too, a glimmer of hope. Despite everything she'd been through, she radiated strength and resilience. She hadn't let hardship break her spirit. Instead, she channeled it into something beautiful, using her experiences to connect with others. That realization stayed with Richard long after they left the cafe that day. As the weeks went by, Richard started noticing more details about the waitress. She always greeted customers with a warm smile, even during the busiest shifts. She remembered regulars' orders, without needing to write them down, and she never seemed bothered by the chaos of the cafe, moving through it all with quiet efficiency. But what stood out most was her ability to find joy in the smallest things, whether it was helping Ethan draw or complimenting someone on their choice of pastry. Richard couldn't help but compare her attitude to his own. As a billionaire, he had access to every luxury imaginable, yet he often felt weighed down by stress and responsibility. He worked tirelessly to build his empire, believing that success would bring happiness. But sitting in that cafe, watching the waitress laugh with Ethan or joke with other patrons, he realized how wrong he'd been. True fulfillment didn't come from wealth or power. It came from connection, from moments like these. One evening, as they were leaving the cafe, Richard finally mustered the courage to approach her. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "for spending time with Ethan. It means a lot to both of us." The waitress looked surprised for a moment, then smiled warmly. "It's no trouble at all. I enjoy it." "Well, I'd like to repay you somehow," Richard continued, pulling out his wallet. "Is there anything I can do?" She shook her head firmly. "No, really. You don't need to do that. I'm just happy to help." Her refusal caught him off guard. Most people would have jumped at the chance to accept money or favors from someone like him. But she wasn't like most people. Her humility only made him admire her more. On the drive home, Richard couldn't stop thinking about her. He admired her strength, her selflessness, her ability to find beauty in the everyday. And he wondered, could someone like her be part of their lives permanently? Not as a favor, but as a true partner in helping Ethan grow? The idea began to take root in his mind, growing stronger with each passing day. What if he offered her a job, not as a waitress, but as a mentor for Ethan? Someone who could nurture his creativity and help him explore new ways of expressing himself. It was a bold move, but Richard knew it was worth considering. After all, sometimes the best decisions come from taking risks, even if they scare you. Little did he know, this simple idea would change not only Ethan's life but his own as well. Richard spent days turning the idea over in his mind. Hiring the waitress to work with Ethan felt like the right thing to do, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. For one, she didn't strike him as someone who would accept charity or handouts. She carried herself with pride, even though her job at the cafe clearly wasn't glamorous. And secondly, Richard had never been great at asking for help or offering it in a way that didn't come across as transactional. He'd always been the kind of person who threw money at problems, believing that was the quickest solution. But this time, he wanted to get it right. The next time they visited the cafe, Richard decided to broach the subject carefully. Ethan was busy drawing again, his crayons spread out on the table like a rainbow explosion. The waitress stopped by, their table as usual, smiling warmly at Ethan's latest creation, a jumble of colors and shapes that somehow made perfect sense to him. "This is incredible," she said, leaning closer to admire his work. "You're getting better every time I see you." Ethan grinned shyly, pointing at the picture. Richard seized the moment. "Listen," he began, his tone casual but sincere. "I've been thinking about something. You've done so much for Ethan, not just here at the cafe, but in general. I can tell how much he enjoys your company, and honestly, I think you have a real talent for connecting with kids like him." She looked up, surprised. Kids like him? Kids who see the world differently, Richard clarified. Who need a little extra patience and understanding. You make it look effortless, but I know it's not. It's a gift. Her cheeks flushed slightly and she shifted uncomfortably. Thank you. But I'm just doing what comes naturally. I don't think it's anything special. It is special, Richard insisted. And that's why I want to ask you something. Would you consider working with Ethan more regularly? Not here, obviously. I mean, coming to our home a few times a week to spend time with him. To help him explore his creativity, maybe teach him new ways to express himself. Think of it as mentoring rather than babysitting. For a moment, she just stared at him, processing his words. Then she shook, her head firmly. I appreciate the offer, really I do, but I can't leave my job here. My family relies on my income and, I understand, Richard interrupted quickly. Believe me, I wouldn't expect you to give up your responsibilities. What if we worked around your schedule, made it flexible enough so you could still support your family while also helping Ethan? She hesitated, biting her lip thoughtfully. It's not just about the money, she admitted after a pause. This cafe, it's where I belong, you know? I love being around people, making them feel welcome. It's not just a job, it's part of who I am. Richard nodded slowly, respecting her honesty. He hadn't expected her to say yes immediately, but hearing her reasons made him realize how much this decision meant to her. I completely understand, he said, and I wouldn't dream of taking that away from you. But maybe there's a way to combine both worlds, to let you keep doing what you love while also giving Ethan the guidance he needs. They talked for a while longer, hashing out ideas. By the end of the conversation, Richard had promised to think of a compromise that would respect her boundaries, while still bringing her into Ethan's life more consistently. As they parted ways that day, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. Over the following weeks, Richard put his resources to work. If there was one thing he excelled at, it was finding solutions to complex problems. He started researching community art programs, hoping to find inspiration for a plan that would benefit not just Ethan, but others like him too. One evening, while scrolling through articles online, an idea struck him so powerfully that he nearly jumped out of his chair. What if instead of simply hiring the waitress to mentor Ethan, he created an entire space dedicated to nurturing creativity in children? A place where kids of all abilities could come together to paint, draw, sculpt, and dream without limits? It wouldn't just provide a platform for her talents, it would give her a purpose beyond serving coffee and taking orders. More importantly, it would honor the memory of her brother, whom she'd spoken about so fondly during their conversations. Excited by the prospect, Richard called her the next day. When she answered the phone, her voice sounded cautious, as if bracing herself for bad news. Hi, he said warmly. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. No, not at all, she replied. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Richard assured her. Actually, I wanted to run an idea by you. Do you remember when you told me about your brother? About how art helped him cope with challenges? Yes, she said softly. Why? Well, I've been thinking about it a lot, Richard continued, about how powerful art can be, not just as a form of expression, but as a tool for healing and connection. And I realized something. There aren't enough places like that in the city. Places where kids like Ethan and like your brother can feel seen and valued for who they are. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. So, here's my proposal. What if we opened an art center? A safe, welcoming space where kids of all ages and abilities could come to create and learn. You'd be the heart of it, the teacher, the guide, the inspiration. We'd design it together, making sure it reflects your vision. And best of all, it would allow you to stay close to your family while still pursuing your passion. There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Richard worried he'd pushed too hard, crossed some invisible boundary. But then he heard her take a deep breath. That sounds... She trailed off, searching for the right words. That sounds amazing. Honestly, I never imagined something like that could happen. But I have to be honest with you. It feels like a lot to take on. I know it does, Richard said quickly. And I wouldn't expect you to do it alone. I'd handle all the logistics, the funding, the setup. Your role would be to bring the soul of the project to life, to make sure it stays true to its mission. She laughed softly, a mix of disbelief and excitement in her voice. You really know how to sell an idea, don't you? It's not about selling, Richard replied earnestly. It's about creating something meaningful, for Ethan, for you, for everyone who walks through those doors. Will you at least think about it? After a long pause, she finally agreed. Okay, I'll think about it. True to her word, she did. Over the next few weeks, they met several times to discuss the details. At first, she was hesitant, worried about stepping into unfamiliar territory. But as they talked, her excitement grew. Together, they envisioned a space filled with light and color, where walls were covered in murals and shelves overflowed with supplies. They dreamed of workshops and classes tailored to different age groups, of exhibitions showcasing student work, of partnerships with local schools and organizations. By the time they finalized their plans, Richard could see a new spark in her eyes, a sense of purpose that went beyond anything she'd experienced at the cafe. And for the first time in years, he felt a similar sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about helping Ethan anymore. It was about building something that would touch countless lives. As construction on the art center began, Richard noticed subtle changes in Ethan too. Knowing that the woman who had inspired him so much would soon play a bigger role in his life filled him with anticipation. He started experimenting with new materials, paints, clay, beads, eager to show her what he could do. Watching his son thrive, Richard realized that the ripple effects of kindness extended far beyond what anyone could predict. What started as a simple act of compassion in a bustling cafe had grown into something transformative. And though neither of them knew exactly where this journey would lead, one thing was certain. Their lives and the lives of many others would never be the same again. The art center opened its doors 6 months later, nestled in a bright, airy building on the edge of the city. It was everything they'd dreamed of and more, walls painted in cheerful colors, large windows letting in streams of natural light, and shelves stacked with every kind of art supply imaginable. There were easels for painting, tables for sculpting, and even a corner dedicated to messy crafts like papier-mâché and tie-dye. The space buzzed with energy, filled with laughter, and chatter as kids of all ages explored their creativity. For Ethan, it became a second home. Every session at the art center felt like an adventure. Under her guidance, he discovered new ways to express himself, ways that didn't rely on words but instead spoke through colors, shapes, and textures. She taught him how to mix paints to create vibrant hues, how to mold clay into animals or flowers, and how to weave stories using nothing but lines and patterns. Each project was tailored to his abilities, yet she always encouraged him to push past his limits, gently nudging him out of his comfort zone. Richard watched these sessions from a distance, marveling at the transformation in his son. Before, Ethan had been hesitant, unsure of himself, but now he moved with confidence, his eyes lighting up whenever he completed a piece. One day, Richard walked into the studio, just as Ethan was finishing a painting, a swirling mix of blues and greens that seemed to capture the essence of a stormy ocean. When Ethan held it up proudly, pointing at the waves crashing against rocks, Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "You did this?" he asked, kneeling down beside his son. Ethan nodded enthusiastically, his smile wide and uncontainable. "It's incredible," Richard said, pulling him into a hug. "You're so talented." Watching Ethan thrive wasn't the only change Richard noticed. Slowly but surely, he began participating too. At first, it was small things, helping clean brushes after a painting session or fetching supplies when they ran low. But soon, he found himself rolling up his sleeves and joining in, creating alongside Ethan under her patient instruction. Together, they built cardboard castles, painted murals on canvas, and even tried their hand at pottery, though most of their attempts ended up lopsided and misshapen. These moments brought them closer than ever before. For years, Richard had struggled to connect with Ethan, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. But here, surrounded by art supplies and laughter, he finally felt like he belonged in his son's world. He learned to celebrate Ethan's victories, no matter how small, and to embrace the messiness of creation rather than striving for perfection. In doing so, he rediscovered a part of himself he thought he'd lost long ago, the part that valued joy over achievement, connection over control. Meanwhile, the art center quickly became a hub for families facing similar challenges. Parents marveled at how their children blossomed under her care, gaining not just artistic skills but also confidence and independence. Many of them shared stories about their struggles, about schools that didn't accommodate their kids' needs, therapists who dismissed their potential, or communities that misunderstood them. Here, however, they found acceptance and encouragement, a place where differences weren't just tolerated but celebrated. One afternoon, as Richard helped set up for a group activity, a mother approached him, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, clutching his arm. "This place, it's changed my daughter's life. She used to be so withdrawn, so afraid to try new things. Now she can't stop talking about the projects she's working on. She feels seen here, like she matters." Her words struck a chord deep within Richard. He realized that what they'd created wasn't just a building filled with art supplies, it was a sanctuary, a place where people could come to heal, to grow, and to find hope. And at the heart of it all was her unwavering dedication and passion. Inspired by the impact the art center was having, Richard decided to take things a step further. He organized a charity gala to showcase the work being done there, inviting friends, colleagues, and influential figures from across the city. The centerpiece of the event would be a collaborative mural created by Ethan and her, a sprawling masterpiece titled Dreams Without Limits. The night of the gala arrived, and the venue was transformed into a celebration of creativity and resilience. Guests wandered through galleries displaying artwork made by children of all abilities, each piece accompanied by a story written by the young artist. Some pieces were abstract explosions of color, while others depicted vivid scenes of nature or family life. Every single one told a story of courage and imagination. When it came time to unveil the mural, the room fell silent. As the cover was lifted, gasps rippled through the crowd. The mural spanned an entire wall, its intricate details capturing the essence of boundless possibility. Swirling galaxies intertwined with lush forests, soaring birds mingled with underwater creatures, and in the center stood two figures, a boy holding a paintbrush and a woman guiding his hand. The message was clear. Art has the power to unite us, to break down barriers, and to inspire dreams we never thought possible. Richard took the stage to thank everyone for their support, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight isn't just about raising funds," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "It's about recognizing the strength and potential within each of these incredible kids. They remind us that limitations are often illusions, that with the right tools and encouragement, anything is possible." As applause filled the room, Richard glanced over at Ethan, who was standing beside her, beaming with pride. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly fulfilled, not because of the money raised or the recognition received, but because he'd played a role in creating something that mattered, something that would continue to make a difference long after the gala ended. But even as the night drew to a close, Richard knew this was only the beginning. The Art Center had planted seeds of change that would grow far beyond what anyone could predict. And as he looked around at the smiling faces of children and parents alike, he couldn't help but feel grateful for her kindness, for Ethan's resilience, and for the reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can lead to the greatest transformations. As the months rolled by, the Art Center became more than just a place for creativity. It turned into a lifeline for many families. Parents who had once felt isolated, struggling to find resources or support for their children, now had a community to lean on. They exchanged stories, shared advice, and celebrated each other's victories, big or small. For Richard, watching this sense of belonging take root was both heartwarming and humbling. He realized that while he'd initially created the art center with Ethan in mind, it had grown into something much larger, a beacon of hope for countless others. But life, as it often does, threw an unexpected challenge their way. One crisp autumn morning, she arrived at the art center looking unusually subdued. Her usual bright smile was replaced by a quiet sadness that immediately caught Richard's attention. When he asked if everything was okay, she hesitated before sharing the news. Her mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Richard could see the toll it was taking on her, how torn she felt between her responsibilities at the art center and her need to care for her family. Medical bills were piling up, and her siblings looked to her for guidance and support. As much as she loved her work, the reality of her situation made it nearly impossible to keep going without sacrificing something. Richard listened quietly, his heart aching for her. He wanted to help but knew she wouldn't accept charity easily. Offering money outright would only make her feel uncomfortable, so he racked his brain for another solution. That evening, after dropping Ethan off at home, Richard sat alone in his study, staring out the window as raindrops streaked the glass. His mind raced with possibilities. How could he ease her burden without overstepping? What could he do to ensure she didn't have to choose between her family and her passion? The next day, he approached her during a quiet moment at the art center. "I've been thinking," he began carefully, "about how we can lighten your load."
"I know things are tough right now, and I want you to know you're not alone in this." She looked at him warily, sensing what might come next. "You don't have to worry about me," she said firmly. "I'll figure it out. I know you."
"Will," Richard replied, "but let me help. Not because I pity you, but because I believe in what you're doing here. This place wouldn't exist without you. You're its soul." Her eyes softened, though she still seemed hesitant. "What are you suggesting?" "Here's the thing," Richard continued. "I want to cover your mom's medical expenses, anonymously, if that makes it easier. No strings attached." She shook her head almost instantly. "No, absolutely not. I can't accept that." Richard wasn't surprised by her reaction. He'd expected it, but he pressed on gently. "I understand where you're coming from, really I do, but hear me out. What if there was another way? Something that lets you stay close to your mom while still doing what you love?" Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about expanding the art center," Richard explained. "We could open satellite locations in different neighborhoods, giving you the flexibility to teach classes closer to home when you need to, and we could hire additional instructors to share the workload, so you're not carrying the entire responsibility on your shoulders." She stared at him, processing the idea. "You'd really do that?" "Of course," Richard said simply. "This isn't just about helping you. It's about ensuring the art center continues to thrive. We started this together, remember? It's our project. Yours as much as mine." After a long pause, she finally nodded slowly. "Okay, let's talk about it." Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly to put the plan into motion. The first step was setting up a smaller branch of the art center near her neighborhood, housed in a converted community hall. It wasn't as grand as the original location, but it had charm. A cozy space filled with natural light and colorful murals painted by local artists. Here she could teach classes during the day and still be home in time to care for her mother. Meanwhile, Richard hired 2 new instructors, a retired art teacher and a young college graduate passionate about inclusive education, to share the teaching responsibilities at the main location. Both brought fresh perspectives and ideas, enriching the program even further. Slowly but surely, the workload became manageable, allowing her to focus on what mattered most, her family and her students. The expansion also opened doors for more kids to benefit from the program. Families who lived too far from the original art center could now access its resources without traveling across town. Word spread quickly, and enrollment numbers skyrocketed. By the end of the year, the art center had become a citywide initiative, supported by donations and partnerships with local businesses. Despite the challenges, she remained steadfast in her commitment to the kids. Even on days when she was exhausted from juggling caregiving duties and teaching, she showed up with a smile, ready to inspire. She taught them not just how to draw or paint, but how to see the beauty in imperfection, how to turn frustration into fuel for creativity, and how to celebrate their uniqueness. For Richard, seeing her resilience firsthand was a lesson in itself. Despite everything she faced, financial strain, emotional exhaustion, and the looming uncertainty of her mother's health, she never lost sight of her purpose. Her strength reminded him of the importance of perseverance, of finding light even in the darkest moments. One afternoon, as they tidied up the studio after a particularly energetic class, she turned to Richard with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never thanked you properly," she said softly, "for everything you've done, for believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." Richard smiled, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I should thank you. You've taught me so much, not just about art, but about life, about kindness, patience, and the power of connection." They shared a quiet moment then, standing amid scattered paintbrushes and half-finished projects. Neither needed to say more. The bond they'd built spoke louder than words ever could. As the seasons changed and winter gave way to spring, the art center continued to flourish. Exhibitions showcased student work in galleries across the city, earning praise from critics and visitors alike. Local newspapers ran features on the program, highlighting its impact on underserved communities. Teachers and therapists began referring families to the center, recognizing its value as a therapeutic outlet for children with disabilities. Through it all, Ethan thrived. His confidence soared, and his artwork gained recognition beyond anyone's expectations. Pieces he created at the art center were displayed in prominent venues, inspiring awe and admiration from audiences of all ages. People marveled at the depth of emotion in his work, the way it captured joy, curiosity, and wonder in ways words never could. For Richard, these achievements weren't just milestones, they were reminders of how far they'd come. From those early days in the cafe to the bustling art centers scattered throughout the city, their journey had been one of growth, connection, and transformation. And though challenges still lay ahead, he knew they'd face them together, as a team, as a family, as a community united by a shared belief in the power of dreams without limits. Years passed, and the art center grew into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. What began as a small idea born out of kindness in a bustling cafe had transformed into a movement, a testament to the power of creativity, resilience, and human connection. The once quiet studio now buzzed with life every day of the week, welcoming children from all walks of life. Some came seeking refuge from bullying or loneliness. Others arrived eager to explore their talents, regardless of why they walked through the doors. Each child left with a little more confidence, a little more hope. Ethan, now a teenager, stood tall among his peers, not just because of his height, but because of the way he carried himself. His earlier struggles with speech were still there, but they no longer defined him. Through years of mentorship and encouragement, he learned to express himself freely, whether through bold brushstrokes on canvas or intricate sculptures made of clay. His artwork became his voice, speaking volumes about who he was and how much he'd grown. One evening, Richard found himself standing beside Ethan at an exhibition hall filled with people admiring his son's creations. It was Ethan's first solo show, titled Worlds Within. Each piece told a story of dreams that soared beyond limitations, of emotions too deep for words, of a boy who refused to let anything hold him back. Visitors lingered in front of one painting in particular, a vibrant explosion of colors depicting a figure reaching toward the sky, surrounded by swirling galaxies and glowing stars. "That's my favorite," Ethan said softly, pointing at the painting. "It's me." Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes. "You did this all by yourself?" Ethan nodded proudly, his smile wide and uncontainable. For a moment, Richard simply stared at his son, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude. He thought back to those early days when Ethan struggled to hold a crayon steady, when even the simplest tasks seemed insurmountable. Now here he was, an artist whose work inspired awe and admiration. As the crowd applauded Ethan's achievements, Richard glanced across the room and spotted her, the woman who had sparked this incredible journey. She stood quietly near the entrance, watching Ethan interact with visitors, her face glowing with quiet pride. Catching Richard's eye, she gave him a small nod, as if to say, "We did it." Later that night, after the gallery emptied and the last guest departed, Richard and Ethan stayed behind to pack up the remaining pieces. She joined them, rolling up her sleeves to help wrap fragile sculptures in bubble wrap. As they worked side by side, Richard reflected on everything they'd accomplished together. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "none of this would have happened without you. You believed in Ethan when I didn't know how to. You showed us both what was possible." She smiled, tying off a roll of tape before responding. "I think we helped each other. You gave me a chance to turn my passion into something bigger than myself. And Ethan, well, he reminded me why I fell in love with art in the first place." Her words struck a chord within Richard. He realized that while he'd set out to create opportunities for his son, the experience had profoundly changed him too. Before, he'd measured success by wealth and influence, chasing accolades and accomplishments. But now he understood that true fulfillment came from moments like these, moments of connection, growth, and shared purpose. Over time, the art center expanded even further, branching out into workshops for adults, therapy programs for seniors, and community events aimed at fostering inclusivity. Local schools partnered with them to incorporate art into special education curriculums, ensuring that kids like Ethan had access to resources tailored to their needs. Even hospitals began collaborating with the center, offering art therapy sessions to patients undergoing treatment. For her part, she remained the heart and soul of the operation. Though her mother eventually passed away, leaving behind a void no one could fill, she channeled her grief into her work. Her dedication inspired countless volunteers, donors, and supporters to rally around the cause, turning the art center into a pillar of strength for the entire city. As for Richard, he stepped away from the corporate world entirely, devoting himself to philanthropy. Inspired by her selflessness and Ethan's triumphs, he established scholarships and grants supporting aspiring artists with disabilities. He traveled across the country, sharing their story and advocating for the importance of accessible arts education. Along the way, he discovered a sense of purpose he'd never known before, one rooted in service rather than ambition. On the opening night of another exhibition years later, Richard stood beside Ethan once again, marveling at how much had changed since that fateful afternoon in the cafe. Ethan was now a young man, confident and articulate in his own unique way. His artwork adorned galleries nationwide, earning recognition not just for its beauty but for the message it carried, that everyone has a story worth telling, regardless of their circumstances. Nearby, she clapped enthusiastically, her smile lighting up the room just as it had all those years ago. Seeing her now, Richard couldn't help but feel grateful for her kindness, her resilience, and the ripple effect of that single act of compassion. Together, they'd built something extraordinary, something that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. When the event ended and the lights dimmed, Richard took a moment to look around at the empty hall. The walls were covered in paintings, photographs, and sculptures, all testaments to the boundless potential of the human spirit. Each piece represented a dream realized, a barrier overcome, a life transformed. Turning to Ethan, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done amazing things, kiddo, things I never dreamed were possible." Ethan grinned, then pointed to a sign hanging above the doorway. It read, "Dreams Without Limits." "We all did it," Ethan replied simply, gesturing toward her, and the team gathered nearby. Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They had indeed, all of them together. From a scribbled napkin in a cafe to a thriving network of art centers changing lives daily, their journey proved that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest transformations. And, as they walked out into the cool night air, arm in arm, Richard knew one thing for certain. Love, creativity, and connection had the power to change the world. One brushstroke, one sculpture, one dream at a time.